Just by way of introduction, I'm Rolf Roscher, Director of Ertz Landscape Architects, Glasgow-based practice. The project St Peter's Seminary, which I'll talk about this evening, our client for the project is the Glasgow-based arts charity NVA. The project, the site, if you can read that, is located, it's near Cardross. Glasgow's down there. It's roughly something like 20-25 miles northwest of the centre of Glasgow. Can I ask how many people in the room are familiar with St Peter's Seminary? That's a lot, that's great. How many of you have physically been there? Great, that's good, that'll help. I'm going to talk about the project from a number of points of view, talk about the history of the project, and in terms of the brief for the talks this evening, it was to talk about the role of the landscape architect ourselves in the project, to talk that through. In terms of the history of St Peter's, the buildings, the seminary buildings, were commissioned by the Archdiocese of Glasgow as a training college for young priests. They're set in a designed landscape associated with the 19th century Kilmahew house, which is about, it's a 40 hectare or thereabouts landscape estate. The seminary buildings were designed by Gillespie Kidd and Coyer, Glasgow-based modernist architects. The building opened in 1966. The seminary buildings wrapped around the 19th century Kilmahew house on three sides, sort of as a horseshoe around the Victorian building. The site, the buildings were abandoned in the late 1980s, so they're only really in use for a bit less than 15 years. And that was a result of a couple of things. One was issues of, if you like, shall we say, not being entirely sort of weatherproof and difficult to heat. But also there was a change in policy within the Catholic Church with, I think, what was referred to as Vatican II in the early 1970s, where they changed their policy of how they train priests to actually train them in the community rather than in a remote location. So the building almost became essentially surplus to requirements. The buildings are Grade A listed, widely regarded as Scotland's modernist masterpiece, and they're on the World Monument Fund's list of the most endangered buildings in the world. In terms of the history of the project, Ertz started working with NVA on the project in 2008. The site and the buildings had been unmanaged for over 20 years at that point, and after 10 years of development now, the project's due to start on site in 2018, so it's quite an odd thing to have a 10-year anniversary before the thing's even actually started. In terms of the role of the landscape architect, really it's been quite a broad slice of aspects of the project that we've been engaged with. Early on, developing the core concepts of the project with Angus Farker, who's the creative director of NVA. We then undertook, if you like, an analysis, a more objective analysis of the site landscape in 2008-2009, co-authored the arts commissioning plan with Angus and Jerry Van Noord, and we led the development of the master plan, which was published in 2011. The conservation strategy for the buildings was led by Avanti Architects as part of that process. And since then, we've been working as part of the design team to develop the proposals in detail, take them through the HLF funding process, which was successful, obviously, and taking the proposals forward, the architectural team has broadened slightly, so it's Avanti and McGinley Bell Architects, and we've, over the last year or so, prepared all of the construction information for the project. To sort of talk briefly, give a brief overview of the landscape itself, the landscape has got a very strong underlying structure around two burns which converge in the bottom end of the site. Both of the burns sit within a pretty strongly defined gorge, so the site's actually quite visually enclosed. For a lot of the time you're in the site, you're actually looking into the site. There's where the burns come together. There's evidence of medieval settlement on the site, most obviously Kilmahew Castle, which interestingly was remodelled in the Victorian era as a folly within the landscape. And there are a whole host of built and unbuilt remnants of the Victorian designed landscape, including Swan Pond, walled garden, other things across the whole site. All of the traces of human intervention from the medieval to the modern exist in a ruined state. And these cultural fragments and the unmanaged landscape is overtaken by invasive species, and it's all in an advanced stage of decline. So what is the project? And I think in terms of, at the core of the project is the ongoing creative programme. This complex, layered history of the site is to act as an inspiration for ongoing art commissions, education and research programmes. And this ongoing educational and artistic investigation is conceived as involving a wide range of participants, artists, academics, local people, designers as well as casual visitors. And that's so far been piloted through the Invisible College. And sitting in the back corner there is Hayden Lorimer from Glasgow University, who's been a core part of the Invisible College and can maybe answer some questions later. At the core of the project is this idea of a generative, metabolizing, if I can say that, creative process where basically one idea builds on and responds to another. And that the idea that the site becomes a model for a new creative and productive landscape. The inspirations for this are varied, things that we've looked at. There are examples in the States, including the Centre for Land Use Interpretation and the Ghost Architectural Laboratory. And in the UK, Lawson Park is an interesting example. And across Europe, we also looked at places very different but relevant in some ways, including Duisburg Nord and Insel Hombruch. What does this programme mean for the buildings? The buildings are to be brought back into use, but in a different way. It's a different strategy to previous attempts to resuscitate the seminary buildings, where there have been a whole series of projects over the last 20 years or so looking at bringing new uses to the buildings, reconfiguring them for residential use. Round the time we started on the project Urban Splash, we're looking at converting the seminary buildings to flats, which was still at the height of the, if you like, the market before things crashed. But even at that point, it wasn't economically viable. So the strategy really is one more of a consolidated ruin with partial restoration. So a good proportion of the structure of the buildings will be held and stabilised in its current state, with some parts of the building, essentially in terms of the main block, this end of it, brought back into use and made a wind and weatherproof space. And that this acts as a venue for performances, for exhibition and for the education programme. I think one of the defining things about the project is that it considers the landscape and the buildings together, and that this idea of a productive and creative landscape is key to activating the building. The two things really being considered together. In terms of the master plan, which we took forward in 2011, it describes all of the interventions that are basically required to realise these creative ambitions, all of the infrastructure around the site. At the core of it, though, is retaining this flexibility and openness to change over time, so that the state really remains in this state of flux with this ongoing generative creative process. The design interventions are basically aiming to distill and heighten the odd tensions that exist between the medieval, the Victorian and the modern, and also the derelict layer within it. So in the areas where we change the site around the seminary buildings, around the walled garden and elsewhere, is really looking at how through the design work we can cause these tensions to become even more interesting. It's also accepting some of these interesting features from the period of ruin. For example, thickets of birch that have grown in abandoned space, actually keeping that strategically in certain areas. Here you see the seminary buildings, in the middle the footprint of Kilmahew House, which was burnt down in, I think, the 1990s. So there's really just the footprint of it and this regenerating birch that sits on it, but keeping that as a block to define that space-defining element at the core of the horseshoe formed by the modern buildings. Related to really the idea of what the site is and the experience of it, there's careful thought given to managing approach and arrival, with parking happening at the edge of the site so that everyone's journeying into and through the site before they reach the seminary or any of the other destinations around the site. And that's seen as a core part of defining the experience and retaining this sense of surprise and discovery that exists on the site at the moment, managing how things are announced and revealed. And an overall ambition for the project and related to the creative programme is to shift people's relationship with the landscape from one of being a passive observer or a detached consumer to having a more active physical or sensory or intellectual engagement. And to help realise this, at times that means introducing a sense of uncertainty, sometimes deliberately disorientating, and not always obviously announcing or interpreting. Over the past couple of years, we've been developing the detailed scheme, and as I said earlier, the construction materials really all there and together, which I won't bore you with. There are literally hundreds of drawings that don't lend themselves to projecting on a screen. And in terms of what's actually physically happened so far, the site was absolutely choked with rhododendron, which has been cleared. There's been management of other invasive species. There's been some advanced plantings. There's also been the asbestos removal from the seminary buildings, which this is the condition of the seminary area before that, and this is how it looks now. So the asbestos has been removed and this sort of layer of detritus is gone as well, which has been fascinating in that because we couldn't, if you like, access the site for a full survey because of the asbestos, a lot of the drawings were initially developed based on the original Gillespie Kidd and Coyer drawings and speculation and where we could see bits and pieces. And then after the asbestos clearance, we were actually able to see what was physically there. So it was an interesting process of that reveal where some of it was exactly as we'd speculated and other bits weren't. So interesting to see, the materials, the patterns, the shapes revealed as that process has all gone forward. And I guess one of the other major things that's happened is, the first big public event, which happened in early 2016, the NVA put together the Hinterland event, a nighttime lighting, sound and walked event. So what happens next? Construction's due to start in 2018 and through 2019, and it's due to open to the public in 2020. So there you go.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.